Hi, everyone. Welcome to Albert Fish Does Dallas Part 2.
Let's get back to this sick bastard.
We had a brief reprieve with the horror show, and now
Here we are again.
here we are. All right.
Mr. Fish.
Lay it on me, Albert Fish.
So this episode, it's going to focus more on his most publicized victim, Grace Budd, who was 10 years old at the time of her death.
Ugh.
And then I'm also going to walk us through his arrest and what happened at his trial.
Okay.
Yeah. So who was Grace Budd? This time, Albert Fish was going by the alias of Frank Howard. There were a couple times he used different names. And Frank Howard's persona, this identity that he had created, is that he was a farmer from Farmingdale, New York. And he responded to an advertisement in the paper for a family looking for work. And this was placed in the newspaper by a man by the name of Edward Budd. So Edward Budd was an 18-year-old man, determined to make something of himself. He's like, I don't want to be poor like my family. I actually want to get out. I want to try to make money.
Okay.
Help us all out. So Frank Howard is then contacted. Frank Howard, i.e. Albert Fish, and Edward's parents, Albert and Delia Budd, say, Mr. Howard, we would love to have you to our home because you seem like a nice man and you're wealthy. And maybe, just maybe, this is the guy that's going to bring us into wealth. So, Ed, how about you go out and work in his farm for a while? So Frank Howard, Mr. Howard, he arrives at Albert and Delia's doorstep with a job offer for Bud's son, Edward. And he states, Mr. Budd, I would like to have Edward come work with me at my farm. And how did he gain this trust? Well, he tells Albert and Delia about his 6 children and how his wife had left him.
Right.
I'm just a
sad sack
of shit who my children really need.
You are a sad sack of shit.
Yes,
that's for sure.
You're a sad sack of shit.
However.
But, I'm all alone. I need help. I have a lot of money and I'm willing to pay whatever it takes to get some help. So imagine at this time, hi there, I'd like to buy your son. I also look like a predatorial grandfather.
Yeah, they just weren't thinking about it.
No, they weren't. And again, if you look up this guy, he doesn't look like he can do a lot of damage. So Edward's sitting there going, and as well as the parents, they're like, oh my gosh, this is money and you're 18, you're old enough to go. So he's looking forward to having this job and for providing for his family. And Howard even offered a job to Bud's friend, Willie. He's like, well, why don't you come too? Right?
Yeah, sweeten the deal.
So Howard planned to come back later, a few days later, to take them back to his farm to begin work. But Howard didn't show. And he provided a handwritten note explaining that he would be in touch in a few days. He said, I'm real sorry. Couldn't quite make it. Probably doing something fucked up over here. Can't tell you what it is.
Disposing of things.
So then he comes a few days later for a visit. He comes over and the family invite him to stay for lunch. Comes over early that morning.
Oh, God.
Okay.
The cannibal jokes abound in my head every time you mention food.
Right.
I'm like, who's for lunch?
Sun and cream is purple. So he's polite, charming, right?
Sure.
Comes in.
I
He's
guess.
describing his large acre land and his farm hands, and he appears like a hearty farm boy looking for help after his family had so sadly left him. But Bud knew, father, that his son really wanted this job.
Okay.
Right. So Bud, he's a dad, and he's like, there is something odd about this dude, but I'm going to ignore it. And I'm going to ignore my instincts because we need money and my son really wants to do this.
Yep.
So during this lunch, they're all hanging out. They're eating Soylent Green. And this young girl comes into the room and immediately catches Fish's eye. Probably because she's a child.
Yeah, this guy.
So
I can't.
He's the fucking pedophile at the table that kind of looks at her and he goes, "Hey, little girl, let me see how good of a counter you are."
Or he already freaking knew.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And went there knowing what he was going to...
So it gets even better. Talk about now they're really ignoring their instincts, because when he says, "Let me see how good of a counter you are," he hands over a huge wad of cash for her to count.
Oh my God.
And the whole family goes wide-eyed and they're like, because they're impoverished.
It's awful.
Right? And
the
they're
con
like,
is just awful.
"Oh my God, all we see is this cash." So she answers quickly, $92.50.
Wow.
To which Fish commented on how bright she was and then gives her 50 cents for her to spend on candy for her and her sister.
Mm-hmm, which is a lot.
A lot. So he then states he'd be back in the evening to pick up Edward and the Bud's friend Willie. And he said that he first had to attend a family member's birthday party and give the boys, and so he's like, "I'm going to give you two some money to go see a movie while you wait for me to come back." Right? At this time, okay, this is where I'm like, come on.
I know, it's hard in hindsight when
At
we
this
read
time,
these things.
he asks the family if he can take Gracie to his niece's birthday party.
Yep.
You know what? I think it'd be a really good idea if Gracie came with me. He would take good care of her and he'd have her home by 9 p.m. to pick up the boys. Grace's mother asks where his sister lives, like, "Where are you taking our daughter?" And he replies that she lives in an apartment on Columbus, right? Somewhere close, right? So Delia, the mother, is like, "I don't know if I should really allow her to go." But then Dad steps in and he's like, "Let the poor kid go. She never gets to go anywhere. We don't have a lot of money. She doesn't get to see much." He says she doesn't get to see much good times.
Yeah.
So Delia allows her to go, but that evening there's no information. They don't get any contact from Fish or Gracie after they leave. So the next morning, Edward was told to go down to the police station, the brother, and he's told by the officer that the address that Fish had provided was completely fictitious. And so the police begin this search and start to investigate the case, but it ends in just dead end after dead end after dead end. So imagine how terrified these parents are, right? Because on one hand, they're going, we're trying to make some money, and maybe we would have offended him if we didn't let her go.
But we had this weird feeling.
Okay.
Oh my God, awful.
So now it's June 7th and law enforcement starts to send flyers nationwide. The New York police at this point aren't strangers to missing children. So ironically, a few years before Grace is abducted, two young boys were actually kidnapped, and the witnesses described the person who kidnapped her, or kidnapped them, as an elderly gray man. So this is where his other name comes in. The gray
Meaning
man.
an old guy.
Yep. What they didn't know was that the old man who was old and frail was our Mr. Albert Fish, a.k.a. Frank Howard.
Right.
So here are the two, right? I had referred to Bill Gaffney in the last episode. So the first one is Francis McDonald was reported missing on the 14th of July, 1924. His body was found hanging by a tree in the woods near his house. The autopsy revealed that he was severely beaten, sexually assaulted, and ultimately choked with his own suspenders. So falls right in the profile of this dude.
Right.
Then we have Bill Gaffney. He was playing in his apartment's hallway. Just so innocent. I mean, imagine just like you're home.
Yep.
And with Billy Beaton and his brother, so a friend and a brother. Beaton's brother briefly left to check on his sister, and when he returned, the two young boys had disappeared. Billy Beaton was later found on the roof of the apartment, but Gaffney was never found. That's how fast this fucker moved.
And it's so fast. Like stronger and faster than he appears.
Yep, exactly. So
Which is a superpower, really,
Oh
is
my
how he
God.
presents is so different than how he acts.
So different. So he asks, when asked about Billy Gaffney, Beaton, the friend, said the boogeyman took him. Not much was assumed of his statement until an eyewitness came forward and identified Fish. The descriptions given by both Beaton and the eyewitnesses pointed, obviously, to Albert.
It's the harmless ones you got to watch.
Oh, yeah. Well, and the ones that feign this vulnerability. And
Yep.
Bundy did with his arm in a sling.
Yep.
Dahmer played this kind of nerdy, unassuming guy.
Mm-hmm.
So there was only one detective that kept this unknown perpetrator at the time of these two boys in his head, or three boys. Only one detective, and his name was William F. King. that'll be important in a moment. So fast forward now to Grace Budd. So Grace Budd was taken to an abandoned house in Westchester County where he goes to undress himself to prevent blood from spattering onto his clothes before luring her upstairs. So at least he was thoughtful enough about his fucking clothing. This guy, he's like a sick clown, right? Like, I'm going to go get naked and then I'm going to go get her. I'm going to lure her upstairs. So
it made sense to him.
She sees him, and at the sight of him, she starts to cry. He starts to strip her naked. He strangles her to death. What follows this, though, is the really, not that it's already disturbing, but what follows this is he begins to cut her into chunks small enough to bake in his oven.
Alrighty.
After he strangled her, he mutilated the body, and he eats the remains over the next 9 days. The really, really, really tragic part in this, if it isn't tragic enough, is that the Budd family wouldn't know of any of this until 6 years later.
Oh.
When a disturbing, unsigned letter arrives for them on November 11th, 1934.
It's just that psychological torture he loves.
The police end up arresting a man by the name of Charles Edward Pope on September 5th, 1930, on suspicion of kidnapping Grace. 66 years old, apartment superintendent. He's arrested after his estranged wife tip off the police. But after remaining in jail for 108 days, imagine that's another 108 days they think they have their guy, right? He's found not guilty. It's not until 4 years later that Fish is actually apprehended.
Man.
So they're just waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting.
Yeah, like they know who it was. That's the guy that left with their kid.
Right.
Like, that's who did it.
So, but because they never heard from him again, how do they know he didn't sell her off to this guy or whatever, right?
Fair.
So let's go back to this letter that arrives now on November 11th, 1934. Delia Budd receives this letter in the mail, but she couldn't read. So she asks her son to read it instead. And after he reads it, he runs out the door to grab Detective King, who was the guy that had kind of had this on his radar, hadn't forgotten this. And the letter was very graphic and described as barbaric, essentially barbarous. So in his letter, Fish reveals that he took Grace to his house upstate where he orchestrated her murder while she was picking wildflowers in the yard. He reportedly choked her to death before eating her flesh. So here's the letter. My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he had two others, went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or a girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body, and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole two boys, one 7, one 11. He took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night, he spanked them, tortured them to make their meat good and tender. First, he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and, of course, the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven. All of his ass boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street, rear right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch, Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said, yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all of my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though. I could have, if I wished. She died a virgin.
That's cold, calculated.
Awful. Horrific. Of a parent's worst nightmare.
Yeah. Everybody always says they want to know what happened to my kid when their kid disappears and is murdered.
And then you wonder.
And then you wonder how this could have not brought that sort of solace. I understand why people want to know. They want an end to the story. They want to be able to grieve effectively. But in this case, I feel like, first of all, it's coming from the killer and it's psychological torture, and it's like one last way for him to get the upper hand. So, and it feels like that when you're listening to it. So,
and 6 years later,
yeah,
he's playing.
He is.
Detective King saw, so the detective I was talking about a moment ago, Detective King, he now sees patterns in this letter that Western Union had received 6 years ago during the other children's murders. So initially there were a few leads because of Frank Howard did not exist. And that was also part of the problem. Remember, is this guy wasn't real.
Right.
Or his name anyway.
Right.
So the police end up finding Fish using the details found on the envelope that he used to send this letter. And Detective King ends up waiting for him at his home at the door when Fish starts to charge at him with a razor blade. He's like, yeah, now I know I'm fucked. Like I've been found out. So King twisted his arm and was able to get the blade away. During his questioning, Fish never once denied what he had done to Gracie's murder. So after Albert Fish was arrested in Grace Budd's disappearance, he was linked to several other cases of murders, molestation, and kidnapping. And among other suspected victims, he did confess to killing Francis McDonald and Bill Gaffney, the two boys before.
We try to keep it light around here, and you're making it really difficult.
I'm sorry.
We try to insert a little humor about these very dark, awful, shadowy things. But no, I find no humor in that letter.
Oh, God.
And I had a feeling that was going to be the case when you told me you were going to read it. I was like, that's going to be fucked up.
It's not, there's not even anything gallows in there it's all bad. It's all bad.
Yeah. Interesting though.
Yeah. So after his trial, Grace Budd and Gaffney and Billy Gaffney had ended that Fish admitted to raping and murdering Francis McDonald. So, he ends up slowly starting to admit all the shit that he's done. And again, you look at that and you go, is it now because he's been caught and here comes the grandiosity? You want to make sure that he gets this right. Okay. So now this fuckhead he's sentenced. But before that,
so he just confesses, basically. Do they do a whole trial?
Yeah, they do a whole trial. So on March 11, 1935, the trial for Grace's murder begins in White Plains, New York. It lasts for 10 days with Frederick P. Close as the presiding judge and Albert F. Gallagher as the DA, James Dempsey as the defense attorney. His stepdaughter, I tried to find information on, it said that he had stepchildren, but other than in the trial part, I cannot find any references to this. So I don't really know who Mary Nicholas was, but allegedly his stepdaughter.
Interesting.
One of the witnesses who testified that he had often made her brothers and sisters play games that were sadomasochistic in nature. When I looked back at that time, he had 6 children, all from the same woman. So I don't know why she was considered a stepdaughter. I don't know. But that's how they label her. So in the trial, the defense argued that he's legally insane. But like I mentioned in part 1, in his insanity plea, he claims that he heard voices from God who instructed him to kill the children. Bullshit. Bullshit. Bull fucking shit.
Mm-hmm.
So they use many descriptions and testimonies to prove to the jury that he was mentally ill. And again, I've talked about this in other episodes. Mentally ill does not equate with insanity.
No.
So the jury didn't believe it, though. He was considered to be a psychopathic personality without a psychosis, and he was actually found guilty. So jury declares him to be sane and guilty. Judge announces his death sentence. He's executed on January 16th, 1936. Fry, motherfucking fry. In the electric chair at the Sing Sing prison, his final words were, I don't even know why I'm here.
Oh, okay. Which
you.
part was
Albert
confusing?
Fish.
Which part was confusing
Which
to you,
part
sir?
was confusing? Now he's going to feign mental illness again. He isn't oriented to where he is and what he's doing.
What?
This guy.
Yeah. So he's convicted and he goes to
He's
prison.
convicted and fried.
Immediately? Did they do it immediately in those
It looks like it
days?
happened pretty quickly.
Yeah.
The
'Cause,
sentencing was
these
pretty
days
quick.
it's like
Yeah.
you're sentenced to death and then there's a period of time where you sit and contemplate your mortality in prison. But
Well,
I guess that didn't
The
happen.
trial was March 11th, 1935. Less than a year later, he's
Yeah, I don't
executed.
think they had they didn't have the red tape we have now where
No,
people
these guys
are
10, 15, 20 plus years
Yeah,
on death row.
that makes sense to
Yeah.
me. That's
He didn't even
awful.
know why he was there.
No, he didn't. He does, of course.
He didn't know why he was there.
Yeah, well, unless he completely lost his mind by then.
Well, they used to call him ham and eggs.
Right. Jesus
That's
Christ.
probably the reason this all happened.
Oh, all right. Well,
Go take a shower.
yeah, right. Final thoughts. What was it like?
It was dirty. I mean, this was a hard one because there's a lot of information. I watched there's some documentaries that I found on YouTube that helped give me all of these horrifically disgusting,
Like the
grotesque details.
Sure.
There's a lot of like the facts are all online, but what I wanted was more of the relationship pieces that I found in the documentaries that spoke more about like who the buds were
Right.
outside. And I thought that was important because of how he went about getting her. We had to understand the dynamic of that family. It would have been really easy to just say, yeah, he kidnapped this girl, but there's so much context there that I wanted people to see like really how good he was in grooming and manipulating and finding very vulnerable people to get, whether they were marginalized because of color or race, marginalized because of socioeconomic status. He knew exactly how to go in and get what he wanted.
Yeah, and they're marginalized by being children.
And yes,
I mean, they're victims by being children,
right.
for sure. So,
developmentally disabled,
yeah,
or intellectually disabled.
some, right?
Some of them were.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think the fact that Grace was the reason why he went down, basically, like he got arrested and ultimately convicted and all of that because of his involvement with that family and her.
Yeah, and I think he was such a psychopath too that it was like everything has a price and I can buy this family.
Mm-hmm.
I can literally just start buying my victims if I want.
Yeah, that's what he was probably doing, and we just happened to know about this one. I'm sure there were others that never even came to fruition or light, and nobody knew that it even happened that way. Because I also imagine if families saw this or understood what was going on and something like that had happened to them or they knew him, they wouldn't have come forward for shame purposes that they had been involved with him or something like that. So, well, I appreciate it. I now know more about Albert Fish than I ever wanted to know.
Listen, the folks ask for true crime and we bring it.
Listen.
It's hard. Listen, it's hard to make this shit light.
Oh, no. It's not It's not a light topic. We have to have, of course, a sense of humor throughout, but we certainly know how serious this is. Okay. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of
If you made it this far.
Appreciate you sticking around. If there's anybody that you'd like us to talk about in future and unravel their psychology, you'll let us know. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Terror Talk. My name is Shannon.
And I'm Kathy. Sleep safe, everyone.